and it does have to do with Robert Strange McNamara, one of the key architects of the Vietnam War, died at the age of 93 at his home on Monday morning. McNamara served as Secretary of Defense from 1961 to 1968 under President John F. Kennedy, as well as President Lyndon Johnson, and directed the early years of the U.S. military offensive in Southeast Asia. As early as 1964, the war in Vietnam came to be called McNamara's War, an association he said at the time he was, quote, pleased to be identified with. Over 500,000 Americans went to war in his watch, a war that ultimately killed over 58,000 American soldiers, at least 3 million Vietnamese. But in 1995, 20 years after the end of the Vietnam War, Robert McNamara published a mea culpa, a memoir that admitted he and his colleagues had been, quote, wrong, terribly wrong, in perpetuating and justifying the war as they did. It was titled, In Retrospect, The Tragedy and Lessons of Vietnam. Less well-known is McNamara's key involvement in the firebombing of 67 Japanese cities shortly before the end of World War II that destroyed 50 to 90% of the cities. McNamara described the bombing operations he analyzed under the command of General Curtis LeMay in the 2003 documentary by Errol Morris, Fog of War. In a single night on March 10, 1945, he told Morris, quote, we burned to death 100,000 Japanese civilians in Tokyo, men, women, and children.
I don't fault Truman for dropping the nuclear bomb. The U.S.-Japanese War was one of the most brutal wars in all of human history. Kamikaze pilots, suicide, unbelievable. What one can criticize is that the human race prior to that time and today has not really grappled with what are, I'll call it the rules of war. Was there a rule then that said you shouldn't bomb, shouldn't kill, shouldn't burn to death 100,000 civilians in a night? LeMay said if we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. And I think he's right. He, and I'd say I, were behaving as war criminals. LeMay recognized that what he was doing would be thought immoral if his side had lost. But what makes it immoral if you lose and not immoral if you win?
McNamara would later become a vocal critic of nuclear proliferation, but during his time at the Pentagon, he expanded the U.S. nuclear arsenal and was a key decision-maker in the Bay of Pigs and Cuban Missile Crisis. A graduate of Harvard Business School, he was also centrally involved in the development of the American and global economic systems. Prior to joining the Kennedy administration, he'd worked at Ford Motor Company for 13 years and had just been named president of the company, succeeding Henry Ford II. After serving as Defense Secretary under Johnson, McNamara was appointed the president of the World Bank, a post he held from 68 to 81. After retiring from the bank, McNamara remained involved as an advisor, consultant, or director with dozens of corporations, universities, and foundations, including Royal Dutch Shell, the Washington Post, the Ford Foundation, Brookings Institution, and the California Institute of Technology. Well, for more on Robert McNamara, I'm joined by two preeminent historians, Marilyn Young, professor of history at New York University and author of The Vietnam Wars, 1945 to 1990, and most recently, Bombing Civilians, a 20th Century History. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Howard Zinn, author of many books, including his classic, A People's History of the United States, joins us on the phone from Boston, and Jonathan Schell remains with us. We want to find out about the secret meeting he had with Robert McNamara. But Howard Zinn, welcome to Democracy Now! Let's begin with you, assessing the legacy of Robert McNamara.
Well, assessing the legacy, it seems to me one of the things we should be thinking about is that McNamara represented all of those superficial qualities of brightness and intelligence and education, that are so revered in our culture. This whole idea that you judge young kids today on the basis of what their test scores are, how smart they are, how much information they can digest, how much they can give back to you and remember. That's what McNamara was good at. He was, he was bright, he was smart, but he had no moral intelligence. What strikes me that we can learn from, one of the many things we can learn from this McNamara experience, is we better stop revering these superficial qualities of brightness and smartness, and bring up a generation which thinks in moral terms, which has moral intelligence, and which asks questions, not do we win or do we lose, ask questions, is this right, is it wrong? And McNamara never asked that question, even when he was leaving, even when he decided, he had to leave in the post of Secretary of Defense, even when we left, and his leaving was not based on the fact that the war was wrong. His leaving was based on the fact, we weren't going to win. Unfortunately, the present administration is still stuck in that kind of thinking. I hear them talking in the White House and around the White House, Obama and the others, about winning in Afghanistan, and not asking, is it right that we are in Afghanistan? So to me, that's one of the important things to think about when we try to learn something from the life of this figure, McNamara. Another thing I suppose I think about is the fact that after he decided that we should get out of Vietnam, after he decided that, he remains silent. He leaves in silence. He doesn't speak out and tell the rest of the country we need to get out. He doesn't criticize the ongoing war, whether it's under Johnson or later under Nixon. No, he sits by silently while the war goes on. This is the kind of unpardonable thing that we should be, I think, very much concerned with.
We're going to break and come back to this discussion. Howard Zinn, historian, author of People's History of the United States and so many other books, and we'll also get comment from Professor Marilyn Young as well as Jonathan Schell. Stay with us.